Identity is very complicated, especially when tied up to language. Just because you are born within a political state does not mean you identify with that being your country. And Wales, the country that I tend to focus on more often than not on this channel, has a very deep and complex series of layers in terms of its identity. Often, when trying to see where we fit, we compare ourselves to other nations. I'm Ben Llywelyn. I'm going to compare Catalunya and Wales for you today to show you just how different they are and why Wales, if it wants to succeed, needs to completely change and choose a new direction, frankly. So aside from the states that Catalonia and Cymru, or Wales, are in, Spain and the United Kingdom, and their legal structures and electoral structures being different, there are 6 main categories which differentiate these two nations and why Welsh nationalists should actually think, well, we're doing things very, very wrong in relation to Cymru as compared to what they're doing in Catalonia. Most obvious, the language. Catalan, if you don't really include Andorra, is the largest non-state language in Europe without a significant political state behind it. We're talking millions of people with no central authority where it is the dominant language. It's not even being allowed to be spoken in the European Union, even though millions of people speak it, which is frankly quite bizarre. We're talking 10 million, over 10 million people as second language speakers and 4.1 million core first language speakers. This is spoken in Catalunya, down through eastern Spain to Valencia, up into Andorra, across the border in France a bit, and on the Isle of Sardinia and the Balearic Islands, Mallorca. So this is quite a varied and extensive territory. Wales is quite confined to what's called Fawr, the Welsh realm, the Welsh region. Just to clarify, Welsh is a Brythonic language, which is one of the 2 branches of the Celtic language family. About 750,000 people speak it, less so within Wales itself, but that's still more, I want to emphasize, than Icelandic, Luxembourgish, Maltese, and Hawaiian combined. So Welsh is not a small language, it's quite significant, and it's just mainly spoken in Wales. There are a few farmers on the border into England who do speak Welsh, and a handful in Argentina. But it's not really, it doesn't have the bolsterous significance of having a varied and diverse multi-million population across more than one country that Catalan has, and what that gives it culturally. Historically, to do with the language, there are reasons for this. Catalan is a Latin-based language in the middle of the Western Latin Gallo-Romance continuum. So to assimilate speakers who speak Spanish or French or Italian, it's not that big of a leap to Catalan. But to assimilate English speakers into Welsh, it's a bigger leap, which means that you're going to have to change tactics to grow your core body, and you're going to have to be much more, well, successful on a rapid pace, because going back into history, at the revival, the Celtic revival, what could be called the Celtic revival in the early, well, the neoclassical into Victorian era, and the Catalan revival, the Renaissance, if I said that correctly, they took very different paths and came at it from very different viewpoints. Catalan with Spanish has an 85% lexical similarity, meaning if you speak Spanish, you can more or less read Catalan and get more or less what people are saying. In Welsh and English, it's not going to work that way. There's a differential there. And this has helped Welsh in other ways. And going into the National Renaissance period, and you had the Eisteddfod, the culture to celebrate Welsh language culture. This not being able to speak English in many areas helped the Welsh not be assimilated into the Anglosphere for a much longer period of time. And you had preachers, nonconformist preachers, Methodist preachers, who were the leaders of national revivals in Welsh for quite a significant time in the 19th century. And these were poets. But in Catalunya, you had poets who were also economists and business owners. And this is a very different set here. Preachers are preaching to people who usually are already convinced. Economists and business people are expansive and recruit people inward. And you have a word in Welsh, llan. And there's a reason why this is so significant in Welsh culture. It means a wall around a church, basically. But a bit more than that in the psychology of Welshness. And it shows how defensive and insular the Welsh national structure, the Welsh national culture can be. And this helps. It has given Welsh a remarkable resilience that hundreds of other cultures around the world which have been extinguished do not have nor possess. It's like an eggshell that withstands water eroding it. But the Catalan is more like a boat going out on the water and bringing new supplies in. And this shelling yourself off, walling yourself off by creating a dense group that does not lose members. This works, but it only works for so long. And what Wales is seeing now is it's gone so long without being expansive and bringing people in to its culture that it's not for much longer able to withstand being turned into an Anglo-speaking culture. And it's losing territory in its heartlands very fast. Catalan is losing a bit in the south of Valencia and on the Isle of Sardinia, where it has a little enclave. But it has re-blossomed in the wake of the Francoist regime in a way that Wales never has in its history re-blossomed in quite the same way. You had Thomas G., who was a nonconformist preacher in the early 1800s, and he was a poet, and he was quite nationalistic and patriotic. And in Catalunya, you had Bonaventura Carles Antal, and these are diametrically opposed. I mean, these two men, one was an economist and one was a nonconformist preacher in a way, or hold those values, and that's nothing like one another. And it's important that we see that when Catalan has turned toward a more liberal economy and openness to business, it has been remarkably successful. And Wales, on the other hand, has been remarkably successful in resisting assimilation, but it's not able to expand because of its defensive and insular structure. These two viewpoints are reflected in how they've kept their languages going. Although that expansive nature, as I'll get to later on in Catalan, did come from historical precedent, as did the Welsh. Shelling yourself off. Monarchy. Catalonia has tried to establish a republic of its own more than once, as we'll get to. Wales has never had a very significant, in terms of its whole population, a republican sentiment. In fact, these two nations redefine themselves in ways that are diametrically opposed. Catalunya redefined itself in the 19th century. Well, it's redefined itself more than once. And these are along grounds that are anti-monarchist. In 1641, Catalan established a republic. Very short-lived, but that's a significant act nonetheless in an age when republics were not that well heard of. I mean, this was the 17th century. At the same time, in the same decade, Wales was fighting for the royalist cause in the English Civil War, providing the longest siege in British history in the name of the king to show its faithfulness in the royalist cause. Its identity as a nation in this period was wound up in its loyalty to the king, whilst Catalonia, its identity, was constructed out of rebellion against the monarchy. You had the War of the Reapers, and this is quite significant. I mean, this is a rebellion that lasted over a decade. It was the 1640s into 1652, in which the working, I guess you could call it the working class, revolted. And at the same time, the Welsh were laying down their lives to protect the monarchy against the revolt. Their two national anthems come from this ideology. Els Segadors, the Reapers in Catalan, celebrates this era of this revolt against this monarchy. The Welsh national anthem, Hen Wlad fy Nhadau, Old Country of My Fathers, is not explicitly Republican in any way. In fact, I think it was able to displace the anthem God Bless the Prince of Wales because it was not attacking the monarchy. The Welsh were consciously aware of this. They did not want to upset the order of things. This is not bad, it's just the Welsh national character. One thing that is really unique about this anthem is that it spread to Cornwall and Brittany, other countries which speak languages related to Welsh, and it became a national song for those countries as well. And this is where I want to bring in the Catalan countries. It's not just Catalonia. So in Wales's case, you have what we could call the British-speaking countries: Cornwall, Wales, and Brittany. And what Wales does is, in its nationalism, it tends to identify as Celtic in a broader sense, without being so consciously aware of its own, well, conservative elements of ancestry, linking it to Cornwall and Brittany in a way that does not link it to Scotland and Ireland. And this lack of awareness of its own cultural root in being separate from the other Celtic group and more close to the Brythonic group is hurting Welsh nationalism, I think, in terms of preventing it from finding a deeper unity rooted in a cultural, ethnic identity from which it comes originally. The Welsh national anthem is a song of love for one's country, but it's not one of rebellion against anything. The Welsh anthem boasts about the age of the princes, the poets, and this is kind of a royal, regal lineage it's echoing here. It's not Republican in any sense, and this is quite a contrast with the Catalan national anthem, when the majority of the Welsh population began to re-accept its Welshness. It was through the prism of embracing the monarchy. And there is a contrast there between Hen Wlad fy Nhadau, the Welsh anthem, and Els Segadors, the Catalan one. Modern Welsh identity was heavily shaped by David Lloyd George, the man from humble origin, Welshman who became Prime Minister of Great Britain. And in 1911, he brought the investiture, the crowning of the Prince of Wales, back to Wales, to Caernarfon. And this was quite radical, actually. He put Welsh names into new Welsh regiments and new Welsh symbols like the daffodil and the leek. At the same time, in Catalonia, you had, in 1909, the Tragic Week, and Catalan revolted in cities across Catalonia against conscriptions by the government to go fight a war, and this is quite a significant difference. The Catalan, at the same time as Welsh, parading and celebrating its loyalty to the empire, was rebelling against Spain in recreating both their national identities at the same time in very different ways. You did have the riots in Tonapandi and Haromba in 1910-11, but this was localized, and this is something I want to reiterate. Welsh uprisings of any kind have tended to be extremely localized in a very narrow area, not national, not united. And this is a very different context to Catalonia, in which the nation has risen, not a little area over issues concerning social justice pertaining to that local community, but the entire nation. And this is very different. Which brings us to the next thing. Rebellion. National rebellion. Hey, if you were liking this content, hey, hit that like button for me. It really helps. Probably the most important thing. Thanks. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Wales has revolted as a nation since its conquest, from what I can see, twice. You had the rebellion of Madog in 1294-95, which was a nationwide rebellion of Wales. And you had Owain Glyndŵr, which was 1399 to, this is debatable. You could say 1410, 1415, but there's proof that the rebellion lingered on in various parts of Wales until the 1420s, which is massive. We're talking 25 years. The longest running rebellion in the history of medieval Europe. So that is quite epic. But still, this is only two national rebellions and nothing in the last 600 years that constitutes a true nationwide uprising. Catalunya, on the other hand, how many times do you think they've revolted as a nation? Well, you had the Reapers' War. That's one. The revolt of the Baratinas. The War of the Spanish Succession. The First Carlist War. The Second Carlist War. And Federalist uprisings in the 1870s. You had the Third Carlist War. And you had the 1909 uprisings I talked about, and the Catalan state. And then the Spanish Civil War. And the 2017 referendum. And the 2017 referendum, which caused a severe backlash from the Spanish state, if you want to include that as a national uprising. So that's well over 10 right there. I'll put the number here, whatever it is that I would estimate. So these two have no similarity in consistency of self-identification and desire for autonomy. So I think Welsh nationalists are going at this in a very bad way by waving Catalan flags, because if you're going to wave that identity, you need to understand how different these two nations are, and why Catalonia is much more liberal and open and expansive. Speaking of expansion, their politics are quite different. In Wales, you have Plaid Cymru, which is a self-professedly socialist party. You also have Gwlad, which is a very minor, I think they're trying to be Welsh conservatives, but I'm not sure where they're going. That's another matter. Anyway, This has not worked for Plaid Cymru, and they've not been willing to change. In Catalonia, the situation is very different. You have Junts per Catalunya, Together for Catalunya, and this is basically liberals, centrists, center-right conservatives in many cases, who have held power. 2 out of the last 3 leaders of Catalonia have come from this type of group. Now, granted, now you have a social democratic party in power in Catalonia, which is more like the British Labour Party in many ways. Plaid Cymru is still looking towards a radical left idea of nationalism, which is more like Sinn Féin, which doesn't really match the character of Wales, actually. Wales, its history in terms of the uprisings I just showed you shows Wales is not a radical nation. It never has been. It has localized flares of radicalism, but as a whole nation, it's never shown that. It's truly radical. You do have the Republican left in Catalonia, but you also have this other force which doesn't have opportunity to express itself in Wales. And I think Welsh nationalists have made a deep mistake in often pitting liberal capitalism and centrism and liberalism generally as an opponent to Welsh values, when this precise attitude is often what has worked for Catalonia. History. Wales, looking back at its history as the Brythonic Celts, the native Britons, has contracted. Catalonia, on the other hand, was expansive. Just listen to this list of conquests and acquisitions. Lleida, Tortosa, the Kingdom of Mallorca, conquered. The Kingdom of Sardinia, conquered. The Kingdom of Sicily, Naples, Athens, enclaves in France, Valencia, Aragon, which Catalonia emerged out of through the House of Barcelona, was expansive. It was a great territorial and commercial power. Wales was not, and it does not mean that one's better than the other. But to understand why Catalonia is successful and Wales is not in terms of its nationalism, you need to reflect upon the competence that expansive and, well, pro-liberal, often pro-mercantile attitudes, pro-commerce, gives a country confidence. In Welsh, hyder, and in Catalan, la confiança. You need this confidence to build any form of successful nationalism when you don't have a state, or to even build successful identity within a state even if you don't want independence. And both of those two are perfectly legitimate. Wanting to exist as a people within a union, or wanting to go your own way because you're not happy. It's a balance between the two, but you need confidence to have a strong identity either way which you go. Even if it's not ruling itself since the 15th century, in Catalonia's case, well, it has ruled itself briefly several times. There is the fact that Wales has not truly been, in recent times, truly oppressed in terms of guns pointing at your head, as Catalonia has. That's a very deep contrast, and as a Welshman, I'm grateful that Wales has not suffered that. But on the other hand, turning that around, it's made the Catalans much more passionate. The Welsh aren't going to get in an argument with you over their country in public. They're not going to go to the bank and refuse to speak English to the teller. They're not going to walk around spray painting walls in their anger. A few, but not many. Catalans You get that. It happens because of passion, the willingness to not back down. And this comes, I think, in the root of it, from that expansive mercantile era in the Kingdom of Aragon, and that confidence that liberal commerce gave them as a country. That commercial aspect reflects itself today in the economy. Catalonia is the wealthiest part of Spain. I know some down in the comments will say, oh, Catalonia is not Spain. I'm just talking about the fact that it's part of the state of Spain, that's all. Wales is part of the state of the United Kingdom, is poor. It's got higher unemployment, especially in the valleys, which ironically have some of the highest self-identifying Welsh people. The highest birth rate of people born in Wales is the poorest part of Wales. There are other factors, such as Catalunya has inroads connecting Spain and France. Wales only has roads flowing into England. Its wealth is like on a tilt, flowing out of its country. Catalunya has Barcelona, a major economic hub, a great city. Cardiff is fine, and I love Cardiff, but it's not one of the great world cities to produce economy in. And this lack of economy is deeply damaging to the Welsh Nationalists, who then parade the Catalan flag without understanding that often the liberal values they attack are the very thing that make Catalan so successful. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave some comments below if you are interested in the cultures of Catalonia and Cymru, and what you think the relationship between them should be. And what do you think the relationship between them and the states they're in should be? Do you think there's a middle road that we can take? Can we reform? Can we be friends without breaking apart? Or can we be better friends by forming different nations? What do you think? Leave a comment below. Hey, diolch yn fawr am wylio. Thank you very much for watching.